A body curled on its side, knees pulled toward the chest, hands tucked beneath the chin, almost gently, as if the person were only sleeping through a cold night. Above the skeleton, a thin red stain runs through the soil, ochre, pressed into the earth more than 40,000 years ago. No wind moved that pigment there. No accident bent those limbs. Someone did this, on purpose, with care. And that single detail, a pinch of red powder scattered over the dead, forces a question that has quietly troubled scientists for over a century. Why would a species fighting for survival spend precious time and precious resources on someone who could no longer benefit from either? Most people assume death rituals began with religion, prayers first, ritual second, meaning third. That is not what the evidence shows. Long before there were gods to appeal to or an afterlife to prepare for, something else was already happening in the dark corners of caves and open-air campsites, something stranger, older, and far more unsettling than worship. Bodies were being arranged. Rewind further, not to humans, to a moment before us. In 2013, cavers wriggled through a passage so narrow that only the smallest human bodies could pass, a chute barely 18 centimeters wide, deep inside the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. What they found at the bottom did not belong there by any natural process. Bones, dozens of individuals. A species never seen before, later named Homo naledi, small-brained, primitive, walking upright on a body that in some ways looked more ancient than anything alive today. The bones showed no scavenger marks, no signs of a flood carrying them in, no evidence they had fallen through some collapsed opening above. Which left one explanation researchers were reluctant at first to accept. They had been carried there, deliberately, through total darkness, down a passage that would have required immense physical effort by a creature with a brain a third the size of ours. If true, it would mean something the field of human evolution was not prepared for. The deliberate treatment of the dead did not begin with us. It may have begun before modern intelligence existed at all. This is where the story stops being about individual burials. It becomes about a pattern buried across the entire span of the human story, a pattern that seems to intensify every time the brain that carries it grows larger, and every time the world around it grows more dangerous. For a species built entirely around efficient survival, death should be simple. A body stops moving. It becomes tissue, food for something else, a resource returning to the ecosystem. Nature rarely wastes anything. And yet, across nearly every site where ancient humans lived, archaeologists keep finding the same defiant gesture repeated. Bodies moved out of the flow of nature and placed instead into deliberate stillness. Something in the human lineage began interrupting the ordinary end of a body. Something began insisting that death required a response. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, researchers uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal, an adult male, buried in a shallow depression, his body positioned with a peculiar intention. Around and beneath him, pollen clusters were discovered in concentrations too high to be accidental windfall. For decades, this was told as one of the most moving stories in archaeology, Neanderthals burying their dead beneath a bed of wildflowers. Later research complicated that story. Some of the pollen may have come from burrowing insects, not human hands. Science, done honestly, does not protect a beautiful idea just because it feels true. But even stripped of the flowers, what remains is still extraordinary. The body itself was placed with intention, angled and positioned in a way inconsistent with natural decay or an accidental death. Something about this individual mattered enough to be handled with care, long after he could feel that care at all. Which raises the more disturbing question underneath the beautiful one. Care for whom exactly? The dead feel nothing. They will never know they were remembered. So if the ritual offers no benefit to the person lying still in the earth, who precisely is it for? That question sits at the center of everything that follows. Because the earliest funerary behavior in the human story was never really about the dead. It was about the ones left standing over them. A grieving mind is a dangerous mind. It disrupts group cohesion. It threatens the trust that keeps a small band of humans alive in a world of predators, starvation, and disease. Left unmanaged, grief could fracture the very group that needed to remain unified to survive the night. Burial, then, may not have started as spirituality. It may have started as damage control for the living, a way of drawing a line between the world of the breathing and the world of the still, a line that let the group step back from the edge of that stillness and keep moving forward. But somewhere along that evolutionary road, something shifted. The behavior stopped being purely functional. It became symbolic. At Sungir, in modern-day Russia, roughly 34,000 years ago, two children were buried head-to-head, their bodies covered in more than 10,000 painstakingly carved ivory beads. Each bead, researchers calculated, would have taken over an hour to produce by hand. That is not damage control. That is hundreds, possibly thousands of hours of collective labor poured into bodies that would never again move, never again see, never again know they had been adorned at all. In a world where every extra hour spent not hunting, not gathering, not sheltering, could mean the difference between survival and starvation, an ancient community chose instead to spend that time on the dead. This is the moment the story stops being about biology. It becomes about belief, because somewhere in that transformation, from careful placement to elaborate adornment, a new idea was being born inside the human mind, one no other species on Earth is confirmed to share. The idea that death might not be an ending, that something of the person could persist beyond the failure of the body, that the beads, the ochre, the tools placed beside a skeleton, the food left at a graveside, all of it might still matter to someone, somewhere, who is no longer technically there to receive it. This single cognitive leap, the belief in continuity beyond death, may be one of the most consequential ideas our species has ever produced. It reorganized how humans understood time itself. It transformed ancestors into a presence that persisted. It gave grief somewhere to go instead of nowhere. And it planted the earliest seed of nearly every religious system that would follow for the next 30,000 years. And once that idea existed, it could not be contained to a single grave. Burial mounds rose across landscapes on nearly every inhabited continent. Cemeteries transformed from scattered acts of grief into permanent architecture, built to outlast the generations that built them. Entire civilizations would eventually organize their economies, their politics, and their spiritual authority around a single unresolved question, first whispered over a body curled in red ochre tens of thousands of years earlier. What happens to us after this? Every pyramid, every tomb, every quiet cemetery at the edge of a modern town is a distant descendant of that same impulse, the same refusal to let a body simply return, unmarked, to the ground. Which brings the story back to where it began. Not to the pyramids, not to written history, but to a small, curled skeleton, stained faintly red, in a shallow scrape of earth tens of thousands of years before anyone could write the word grief. That gesture, small, quiet, almost invisible in the vast timeline of human existence, may be one of the earliest pieces of evidence that our species had begun to understand something no other animal appears to fully grasp, that we end. And somewhere in that terrifying knowledge, in a cave in the cold, someone reached for a handful of red pigment and decided that ending deserved a response. Every ritual since, every funeral, every headstone, every candle lit in memory of someone gone, is simply humanity still answering that same ancient impulse, still refusing to let the dead disappear in silence. Still, after all this time, unable to walk away from a body without saying in some form, "You mattered."